Hello, everybody. It is Saturday, August the 24th, 2024. A few episodes ago, we did an interesting show with a couple of academic friends of mine, Jeff Kopstein and Steve Hansen. They have a new book out. It's called The Assault on the State, How the Global Attack on Modern Government Endangers Our Future, which protects the state, the bureaucracy in America and around the world. It's a similar argument in a sense that I think Michael Lewis articulated in his important book from 2018, The Fifth Risk, which was about Trump's attempt to strip government and bureaucracy of its functionality. Our guest today on the show knows all about this. Glenn Fine is a long-time I don't know if I would want to call him a bureaucrat, certainly a man central to the state. He was the Inspector General for the Department of Justice between 2000 and 2011. And he also was the victim in 2020 of, he was one of the five that Donald Trump, one of the five Inspector Generals, that Donald Trump dismissed in April and May of 2020. He has a new book out. It's called Watchdogs, Inspector General and the Battle for Honest and Accountable Government. And of course, Glenn is joining us from the heart of American government, Washington, D.C. Glenn, congratulations on the new book. I assume you're familiar with the Michael Lewis book. I'm guessing you probably know Jeff Kopstein's new book, although I think you'd find it interesting. Is that broadly what you are trying to do in Watchdogs, and indeed what your career as a government official, a leading legal bureaucrat, is that what you're in the business of doing, protecting the state?
I wouldn't call it protecting the state. Inspectors general are critical check and balance in our government. Their mission is to detect and deter waste, fraud, and abuse in government, and to promote the economy, efficiency, and effectiveness of government. There is an IG in every federal agency now whose mission is to oversee government. And many people don't know that there is such an office and such a entity doing that. And I do think it's critical to our government to make it more honest, more accountable. And it is a challenging job. You're independent of the department, but you are there in the department to try and make it better. So I do think it's one of the strengths of our government, one of the strengths of our democracy. And I wrote the book to expose more people to that important role and try and encourage students and others to go into that public service, but also to have citizens and lawmakers support, protect, and extend the concept of an inspector general.
Glenn, you graduated from Harvard Law School in the middle of the 1980s, so you've been in this business a while. Has something changed over the last 40 years or 35 years since you've been doing the law and been involved in government? There are many theories, and you don't need me to tell you this, of the deep state, this supposedly corrupt state in America. Was there always, even back in the late 20th century, was there a deep suspicion of men like yourself?
I don't know if there's a deep suspicion. I do think people are uncertain about their government and how their government operates. And I think that's one of the benefits of an inspector general, to make transparent how government operates. We report both to the head of our agency and to Congress, but ultimately we report to the American taxpayer to let them know how their tax dollars are being spent. And there is I think there's always been some concern and maybe a little bit of cynicism about government. But I think from what I've seen from inside the government, the vast majority of government servants, and I don't call them bureaucrats, I call them public servants, are honest, hardworking, conscientious. Some of them are deployed abroad, put themselves in harm's way. I talk in the book about true heroes, law enforcement agents, one of whom in my office was killed in the line of duty. So I do think these are dedicated public servants, but in any large operation, any large government, there will be problems, there will be issues, there will be deficiencies. And that's the role of the inspector general, to point it out, to try and make reasonable recommendations to make it better. I think over time, in response to your question, I think we have become a little more polarized and less willing to accept the reports of government agencies and even inspectors general. So I do think there is a tendency to retreat to our different political positions. But that's the benefit of an inspector general. It's a nonpartisan position. Inspectors general normally remain when administrations change because they are nonpartisan and they're there to speak truth to power. That's what we tried to do.
They are, at least in theory, our most trustworthy individuals, our most trustworthy players in the state. Talk to me about why, if you were making this argument with someone who had been seduced in some ways by suspicions of the deep state, tell me why we should trust these people, why they're not unbiased. I mean, when you listen to this post-liberal authoritarianism, not just in the US, but around the world, there seems to be a deep suspicion that anyone can be unbiased, that anyone can indeed be trustworthy.
Well, I do think we need to trust but verify, in the famous words of Ronald Reagan, and that's the benefit of an inspector general. You have someone inside the agency making reports and exposing the operations of government. And what we tried to do, what I think is important, is not simply to say, take my word for it. There wasn't a problem here or there's a problem there, but we try and disclose the facts on which we base that conclusion. So our reports in the Justice IG's office, where I worked, in the Department of Defense IG office, was very lengthy. It explained what we found. It explained the facts and the evidence. It came to conclusions so that people could draw their own conclusions. So if they read the report, they can see what we found and why we are making the conclusions that we are. And so, as I say, in any large organization, there will be problems. I'm not saying everyone is perfect, but I think the benefit of an inspector general and what happens in government is we try to correct our problems. We try to expose our problems. We try to improve the operations of government, even if it's not perfect. And that's what I've seen from the inside. As I say, dedicated, hardworking individuals. Many of them some of them make mistakes for sure, but by and large, and some of them, there are some dishonest people, and we have a law enforcement part of our office that would investigate individual for misconduct, some of it criminal misconduct. But by and large, that's not the norm, and we do try and improve and correct it. That's why I think IGs are so important. They are guardrails on government, and they expose problems without fear or favor.
So are IGs in the business then of looking for, you mentioned corruption, is this corporate bribery? Is it self-aggrandizement? Is it the meddling of foreign powers?
No, we have jurisdiction over our agency, and we have both an audit operation where we audit programs and evaluate programs. We also have an investigative aspect as well. So we do administrative investigations for misconduct by agency officials, ethics violations, for example. But we also have a criminal arm that does investigations of, criminal corruption. Some of it is by officials in the agency, some of it by people who take money from the agency. So, for example, in the Pentagon, when I was the Department of Defense IG, we did investigations of some contractors for bribery, for mischarging, for deficient parts. We did investigations of individuals within the Department of Defense for taking bribes, for fraud, for other misconduct. So it runs the gamut. And what we try and do is expose and prevent and bring to justice anyone who would be corrupt or abuse their office.
A few weeks ago, we did a show with Craig Whitlock, who's written a book, the book, I think, on Fat Leonard, one of the most notorious corruption scandals in the U.S. Navy. His book is Fat Leonard: How One Man Bribed, Built, and Seduced the U.S. Navy. How typical do you think Fat Leonard is? And was this success in some ways perhaps a reflection of the inaction or inattentivity of the IG at the time?
No, I wouldn't say that. The IG was the one who exposed this problem, and I've read that book. It's an excellent book. It describes in significant detail the corruption of Fat Leonard and how he seduced and bribed many Navy officials to give him contracts, to change the routing of their ships to his ports, to overcharge the government, and they let it go. He was like an intelligence agent. He knew what someone's weakness was, and he would exploit it until they were on the hook, and then he would use that and overcharge the government. So that was a problem. It was widespread in the Seventh Fleet throughout the Pacific, and it was surprising how many Navy officials took the bait. It was a stain on the Navy's honor. It was in my view, the worst corruption scandal in Navy history. On the other hand, it was exposed and people were brought to justice. And I think that in some sense is a reflection of that there are checks on government. Now, I wish it had happened sooner. He also bribed the law enforcement agents in the Navy, NCIS, Naval Criminal Investigative Service, to prevent them from investigating. But when our office got involved, the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, an arm of the Department of Defense IG's office, before my time they got involved, and they mounted a effective and significant investigative effort to expose his problems and to bring him to justice.
Glenn, though, and correct me, please, if I'm wrong, you know this stuff inside out, hasn't even the Fat Leonard trial, I think he was being tried in San Diego, or he's in prison in San Diego, hasn't even that hit a wall? Hasn't he been able to, if not manipulate the American legal system, certainly use it in a way to successfully keep himself out of jail?
Well, he's in jail, but no, it has had problems, that prosecution. He was cooperating with the government. And then when the trials were over, when he was about to be sentenced, he absconded. He fled to Mexico and then on to Cuba and then Venezuela and trying to get to Russia. But he was arrested before he was able to get to Russia. And eventually he was extradited back to the United States in a prisoner exchange. He is now in prison. He will be sentenced. The problem that you're referring to is the prosecution in one of those trials did not disclose exculpatory evidence in a timely way, and that undermined the prosecution. On the other hand, that's a function of our system. The prosecution has to dot all its I's and cross all its T's, and if there are problems, it will undermine the eventual prosecution, and that's what happened as well. Now, these people were still convicted, but they were allowed to plead guilty to lesser offenses, which is not a good thing.
We've done a number of shows, Glenn, on the 1990s and the origins, the seeds of right-wing vigilante terrorism, the Timothy McVeigh bombings, for example, in Oklahoma City. I know you wrote about them in your book and the role of the IG in that investigation. Tell me a little bit about that and what the McVeigh investigation tells us about the strengths and perhaps the weaknesses of the IG system.
Well, I think it's the strength of the system. I was the Inspector General at the Justice Department during the McVeigh matter, the McVeigh prosecution. And what happened was McVeigh was arrested and taken to trial. And according to the agreements between the prosecution and the defense, all sorts of documents from the FBI had to be disclosed prior to trial to defense. After the trial, when he was convicted and sentenced to death, it came out that there were scores of documents, thousands of documents that the FBI had not disclosed to the defense. The execution was delayed. My office was asked to investigate how this happened, how it happened that they had not disclosed the documents that they were required to. And we did a thorough and quick investigation, timely investigation, and found significant problems, both in the FBI's systems for tracking documents, but also individuals who should have known better and should have provided those documents. We also made recommendations to improve it and to prevent it from happening in the future. So the IG can't, in advance, solve all problems or prevent. It's not the panacea. It's not going to make everything perfect. But the IG system works because it exposes the problems that had occurred and makes recommendations to try and prevent similar problems from happening in the future. And I'm not going to say that an IG will prevent all problems from happening, but I do think it makes it better and improves operations. And it is given the authority and the jurisdiction to report on anything they find. And I think that's what we did in the McVeigh case, disclose the problems that had occurred.
I'm old enough to remember, of course, the original bombing. There were lots of I don't know if they were deep state theories, certainly populist theories about the bomb being planted by Muslim terrorists. To what extent was the investigation and the prosecution of McVeigh a model for investigating these kinds of political crimes in America? A terrible political crime. I mean, it killed hundreds of people, including many children.
Well, I think the prosecution was effective and the investigation was effective. He was arrested very quickly, and the prosecution, in a very public way, exposed what he had done and resulted in a conviction. The problem with the document handling was significant, but even then, that wasn't swept under the rug. It was discussed, it was made public, and people moved on. Obviously, there are problems of domestic terrorism. It's existed since McVeigh and before McVeigh, and there's concerns now. I'm not in the Justice Department anymore, so I can't describe the extent of it, but we are living in a time where there's credible tensions, and it's not something to ignore.
There's, of course, in America, and again, you don't need me to tell you this, paranoia about overseas terrorism that was both caused and created, I think, by the 9/11 bombings. You write a lot about this also in your book and about Guantanamo. To what extent is this chapter, from a legal point of view, a stain on the American state?
It was a problem, and that I believe shouldn't have happened. But on the other hand, it was...
Well, sorry to interrupt, Glenn. Yeah. Explain, when you say it's a problem that shouldn't have happened, what exactly shouldn't have happened?
Yeah, so I write in the book, there's a chapter about the response to the 9/11 attacks. And after 9/11 attacks, there was a widespread investigation called PENTBOMB to both investigate what had happened, prevent future attacks. And as part of that, many undocumented immigrants were arrested and detained, most of them in the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. And they were held in many ways incommunicado. They weren't given access to lawyers in a timely way. They were physically and verbally abused in prison. We received complaints about that, and then we decided to open an investigation of it. And we did document that these people were mistreated and that they weren't given the access to lawyers as they should have been, and that both the Immigration and Naturalization Service and the Bureau of Prisons and the FBI didn't follow the appropriate processes and procedures. We issued a very lengthy report on that, and it caused a little bit of a firestorm. I was criticized by some who said, "Oh, I'm undermining the counterterrorism effort." There were some people angry at me. And on the other hand, I thought that this was something that should be done, that's what an IG does. It takes unpopular positions, but it also exposes problems and tries to correct them. And ultimately, many people agreed with that and with the importance of the report. It was at a time when there was very significant concerns about terrorism and follow-on attacks. But we felt it was important to ensure that the United States and its government followed the rule of law, followed its values, even in times of crisis. And I rejected the principle that we could only do one or the other. That is, effectively fight terrorism or protect civil rights and civil liberties of people. We could do both. And that's what the report said. And I think it had a positive impact.
What makes a good or a great IG, Glenn? Now, you graduated from Harvard Law in the mid-'80s. You've made your career as an IG. Now you're a fellow at Brookings. You teach at Georgetown Law School. You have taught at Stanford. You haven't become a wealthy man through the law. You could have been, had you probably chosen to go into private practice. You could have, certainly as a graduate of Harvard Law School. Did you always know that you had and I use this word carefully, the dispassion to be an IG? Is that what it requires?
Well, first, let me tell you how I got into it, and then I'll tell you what I think makes an effective IG. What are the qualities? I didn't know what an IG was. My first job out of law school, though, was as a prosecutor. I got a job as an assistant United States attorney in Washington, D.C. And I'll never forget the first time I went into court. It was for a sentencing for a defendant, and the defense counsel argued why the defendant shouldn't be incarcerated. Then the judge looked over in my direction and said, "What is the position of the United States?" And I looked over my shoulder, one shoulder, then the other shoulder looked behind me and realized in this courtroom I represented the United States of America.
How did that feel?
It was a heavy responsibility. It was inspiring, and I never got out of my blood. So I did that for a number of years. I did go to a law firm for a little while, but it didn't have the same satisfaction for me. So I was looking to get back in government, and I was introduced to the Inspector General of the Department of Justice. I did not know what an Inspector General was. When people think of an Inspector General, I bet some people think of Inspector Javert from Les Miserables or Inspector Clouseau from Peter Sellers' movie, maybe even Inspector Gadget. I learned about an Inspector General and what they did, and I took the job in 1995, and I found it incredibly rewarding, satisfying, and meaningful. You can have an impact on government. You can have an impact on our citizens. You get involved in the most salient issues of the day, and from the inside, you have tremendous responsibility and ability to affect how government operates. And so that's why I did it, and that's why I really enjoyed and got incredible meaning from the job. So what makes an effective IG? I think there's several things. One is it has to be nonpartisan. That's in the Inspector General Act. You shouldn't have a partisan background. Two, you have to be tenacious. People will put roadblocks in your way. You have to keep going, and you can't issue one report and think it's going to solve all problems. You have to be tenacious and follow up. But I think the most important thing is you have to be independent, and that's in the IG Act as well. IGs are independent, and they are not going to be everybody's friend. They're not going to be popular. They're not going to be liked. You have to do things independently from the agency and from the Congress, and issue reports based on the facts and the evidence. You have to be independent both in fact and appearance. And I'll give you another story. So when I became an IG, I worked at the Justice Department. I worked with 5 attorneys general over 3 administrations, and in the Department of Defense, I worked with 4 secretaries of defense and 2 administrations. And not all of the heads of these agencies understood or knew about the independence of an IG. So I would, when they first came into office, set up a meeting with them, discuss with them the responsibilities, the jurisdiction, and the independence of the IG, how we operated independently from them. And I'll never forget the reaction of one of those attorney generals. After I discussed this, he looked at me and scratched his head, and he said, "So you're telling me that I can order everyone else around in this building, Main Justice Building, tell them what to do, tell them what to audit, what to investigate, but I can't tell you?" And I said to him, "Yes, that's what I'm telling you. That's what the Inspector General Act requires." And he stared at me intently, and then he said, "Okay, that's what the law is. We follow the law around here." And he did, as did all the others. And I think is a strength of our system that they did, and that I was able to do these investigations and these audits and these reports, some of which made them very uncomfortable, and issue them to the American public without interference. That's the benefit of an IG system.
Glenn, what would you make, and I don't know if this is Trump's position himself, but the Trumpian idea that everyone has interests, that everyone has a master, that presumably as a citizen, you vote in elections, that you have biases, that your family has biases. Is there any truth in that? Or can one be truly dispassionate as an IG, as I'm guessing you think you are or have been?
Well, that's what we try and be. That's what I try and be. Yes, we're people, we're individuals, but we leave that outside the office. We leave that at the office door. And when we do our investigation, we do it down the middle. And by the way, there's many, many people in an IG's office, not just the IG. And in the Department of Justice IG's office, we had 400 people, dedicated public servants. Department of Defense IG's office, we had over 1,700 employees. And if you were skewing the reports, they would say something. If you were being biased, they would say something. And there are checks within the IG system as well. So you can't try, and it's not going to be effective. You're not going to work. It's not going to work well if you try and skew your reports to one side or the other, because it's all out there. The facts are there, and you're going to have to go up to the Congress and explain the report. And there's people on both sides of the aisle with different pressures. So you have to play it straight down the middle. That's the only way you can be effective. That's what we tried to do. And I think that's what we did accomplish.
When you go to Congress, though, it seems as if one party in particular doesn't have faith in what you're doing. Perhaps not every member of that party, but are you concerned with the suspicion of the bureaucracy that it's biased in this country?
I am concerned with that belief. I will say, however, that members of Congress, both sides of the aisle, rely upon IGs and by and large support the work of IGs, both Republicans and Democrats. And I think IGs in some sense are viewed as some of the last truth tellers. And how do I know that? Because they keep asking IGs to do more and more. They keep asking for investigations from IGs. And I testified 55 times, over 50 times, almost 55 times when I was the IG at the Department of Justice and Department of Defense. And yes, I got grilled by both sides of the aisle, but and they tried to use our reports to fit their agenda, both in both directions. But I think by and large they respected what we did and appreciated the rigor that we brought to our office. Sure, there are people and members of each party who criticize any government public servant or try and undermine the reports. Yes, that happens. But by and large, I think IGs are still viewed on Capitol Hill as objective entities that improve the operations of government.
You mentioned you'd read Fat Leonard, Craig Whitlock's excellent book. I think it's a bestseller now. When Craig came on the show, I asked him how he thinks Fat Leonard got away with it, bribing all these senior figures within the Navy. And he suggested in some ways that these men weren't, and they seem to be men, weren't particularly well paid. Do you think, I mean, I don't know how many, I don't know whether there have been any investigations into the IGs themselves, but do you think that public servants, whether it's naval officers or bureaucrats or IGs, are they both well paid enough, and are they sufficiently respected in America for people to do their job, for them to be incorruptible?
So in terms of pay, some of the, maybe not enough, but there's no way you can pay the number of public servants that
So what would
exist.
an IG, someone like yourself, what would you make? Over $250,000 a year?
No, 185,000, I think, is what it's all public. I think it was $185,000.
Which isn't a lot of money in 2024 America, particularly living in DC.
You don't do it for the money. You don't get monetary benefits similar to in private practice.
Yeah, but you still have to pay
do
your
it
bills and pay your rent and clothe your children.
Right. If you really want a high-flying lifestyle, don't become a public servant. Don't become an IG. That's not why I did it, for the money. I did it for the satisfaction. You have tremendous psychic compensation, doing interesting things, being involved in important issues, having an impact. I wouldn't trade that. Now, by the way, I did work in a law firm for a few years. It was lucrative. It just wasn't the same for me. And
should the culture more broadly, should we celebrate, maybe not IGs, but public servants like yourself more? It seems as if most Americans have no idea what you do or men like you do, and that there should be more celebration and respect. Everyone celebrates and respects sports stars and entrepreneurs, but not bureaucrats.
Yeah. So I do think we should celebrate and respect them more. Not me necessarily, but the heroes of government, law enforcement agents, people who toil away and not much pay, often abroad, often under difficult circumstances. I think Michael Lewis's Fifth Risk talks about that. I think that's another great book. But no, we don't. And sometimes, and by the way, I a lot of times use the word bureaucrats in a negative way. Oh, these bureaucrats, meaning like, oh, they're just like bean counters. They just follow these rules for no good reason. That's not what I saw. I saw people dedicated, not everyone, but most of them, dedicated public servants who tried to do the right thing, who tried to improve government, who were, made sacrifices and did, help their fellow citizens through government.
So Glenn, maybe we should use the term public servants instead of bureaucrats. Maybe we should eliminate the word bureaucrats. You're suggesting it's not very helpful.
I agree with that. I mean, when you say bureaucrat, it sounds like you're spitting out, not you necessarily, but people are like, oh, that these pointy-headed bureaucrats are, are just getting in the way. But I didn't see it that way. I saw it that, that public servants sacrificed to make sure government runs so that we're protected, that our liberties at stake. I mean, think about the people in the Department of Defense deployed abroad to protect our interests, that many who've made the ultimate sacrifice away from their families. Can I tell one more story? I mean, this is, this is kind of indicative. So I think an IG job is tough. We've talked about it. You get criticized by all sides. You're either a lapdog or a junkyard dog. It's either a whitewash or a witch hunt. You're either too hard or too soft. Sometimes by all sides in the same case. So it is a hard job, but it's not the hardest job. And so this is the story. When I was the lead inspector general for overseas contingency operations when I was acting IG at the Department of Defense, and I had to travel to Afghanistan, Iraq, around the world to meet with the commanders there, to issue reports on the status of them. And to get to Afghanistan, you couldn't obviously fly commercial. You had to go on a military plane. So we're flying on a military plane, a C-17 cargo plane. And I go with the State Department IG, the USAID IG, and a few of our staff. We get on the plane, and the pilot of the plane, Army officer, goes over to the state IG and says, "Are you the DOD IG? I want to speak to the DOD IG." And he said, and the state IG said, I'm not the Department of Defense IG. It's that guy over there. And he pointed to me. So the pilot comes over to me and says, "You the DOD IG?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And I'm thinking, okay, what's the issue? A lot of times people had a beef with us. Did we investigate him? Did we investigate his friends? We're not the most popular people. So he says to me, "Well, welcome aboard, sir." I said, "Thank you." And then he says to me, "I really wouldn't want to have your job." And I said to him, "Why wouldn't you want my job?" He said, "Because I read about all the things you have to do, all the things that land on your desk. You piss everybody off. Nobody's happy with you. You have to investigate high-level people. All the stuff you have to deal with." He used a different word that began with S, that you have to deal with. "I just really wouldn't want your job." And I said, "Well, it is a tough job, but I think we're having an impact."
You should have said, "I wouldn't want yours either, flying around the world."
That's the point. I said, we have a tough job, but I wouldn't want your job. You are flying a military aircraft into a war zone every day. You're getting shot at every day. I'm not. After a few days, I get to go home and sleep in my own bed. You do this every day, and you're away from your family, risking your life every day. You have the tough job, not me. And he said, "Well, I guess we're both in the right job then, aren't we?" And I laughed, and he laughed, and he said, "Well, I'll get you there safely, sir." And he did, as did other people around the world. So it's a hard job being an IG, but it's not the hardest job. Other people make tremendous sacrifices.
So what you're saying is, rather than thinking of IGs and other senior public servants, we're not calling them bureaucrats anymore, Glenn.
Thank you.
we shouldn't think of them as pointy-headed. We should think of them as being broad-shouldered. That's the key metaphor.
I think that's an interesting metaphor. I think they make our government better. They perform a public service, and that, in some sense, that's why I wanted to write the book. It's my story, but it's not only my story. It's the story of unsung heroes in the IG community, in the government, who toil in the trenches to try and improve operations of the government to make our country better. And I think they are a critical strength of our democracy. I think they're a pillar of our democracy. What other country gives an entity like an IG such jurisdiction, authority, resources within the agencies to point out problems with the agencies, to have the independence to do that, to write public reports about that? Other countries have similar watchdogs, but not with the same authority, jurisdiction, and power. And I think that's the value of our IG system. In fact, I would regularly get foreign officials, some from our counterparts in other countries, come to our country and talk to me and other IGs about our system, and they would marvel at it. They would marvel about the strength of our system. It's not perfect. I make 12 recommendations in my book to improve it. We certainly need improvement. It's never perfect, but I think it's a strength of our system that we ought to make even stronger. And that's, in some sense, the message of my book. These are critical public servants and they should be supported, protected, and the role of IG should even be extended.
Couple more questions. Glenn, you described the IGs as pillars of democracy. As I said at the beginning, you were part in 2020, in April and May of 2020, the kind of night of the legal long knives, when Trump dismissed 5 IGs, including yourself. I know you don't particularly want to be political, so you can sidestep this question, but was Trump perhaps in this mass dismissal of inspector generals trying to undermine American democracy? Was he pulling some of the pillars down so the whole temple would collapse?
Well, I don't think the whole temple would collapse, but he said he wasn't favorable toward IG oversight. He thought IGs had not treated him favorably, is what he said. And in a short period of time, he either dismissed, replaced, tried to replace, or denounced 5 inspectors general. I was one of them. My situation was I was the acting DOD IG, and then the COVID hit, and the Congress appropriated trillions of dollars in pandemic relief funds, but also created a committee of IGs to oversee those funds and detect and deter waste and abuse in the use of those funds. One of the IGs had to be selected to chair the committee. I drew the short straw, so I was selected to chair the committee, and my selection was announced one day, and a few days, within a week, I was replaced. He replaced me as the acting IG of the Department of Defense, meaning I wasn't on the committee anymore. I was not leading the organization. And so that was it. He did that. He replaced the State Department IG, the Intelligence Community IG, the Department of Transportation IG, and it sent shockwaves in the IG community. It wasn't normal to do that. And I think we need to ensure that IGs are, protected and defended. And so that was a challenging chapter in IG's history.
Finally, you mentioned you conclude the book Watchdogs with 12 recommendations. There's a possibility that Trump will come back to power. Again, don't need me to tell you this, in November. So we might go through the same cycle. Of the 12 recommendations, are there any that will ensure that he can't do this again? Just get rid of the IGs who he thinks are somehow against him, or similar presidents, populists on the right or the left?
So it is in the president's authority to remove and replace IGs. It hasn't happened before, very rarely, I would say. The norm has been when administrations change, IGs remain. That's why I remained in the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations as justice, and Obama and Trump administrations. But he has the authority to remove them. Then an acting IG would have to come from within the office, or another IG from within the community, and he would nominate others. So it's possible. I don't think any of my recommendations could prevent that from happening, but there's some that could provide a disincentive. I think an IG should have a term of office, like the FBI director has a 10-year term. The head of the Government Accountability has a 15-year term. I think that would be important.
We couldn't give him lifetime like the Supreme Court, though.
No, I wouldn't. Yeah, I think there should be changes in IG. I stepped down after 11 years. That was long enough. I think change is good for an organization and for an individual. We also have an issue on the other end, by the way, on the other side, which is there's 74 IGs. Most of them, the overwhelming majority, are doing their jobs well and competently. There are a few who are not good, need to be replaced. This administration, until recently, hasn't replaced any. And I think there needs to be a better way to evaluate IGs, not by the agency head, because I want them to be independent, but by perhaps a committee of IGs, the head of the Government Accountability Office, others, so that if there are IGs who have been in office too long or not doing their jobs effectively, there can be a recommendation to the president to change that IG, and the recommendation would be objective and nonpartisan. And I think that's something that we also need to consider. Protect the ones who are doing their jobs well, but also have a nonpartisan, objective process to remove the ones who are not.
Well, finally, Glenn, you mentioned these 12 recommendations you have in Watchdogs. I'm not going to give you the opportunity to describe all 12 of them, but if you could only choose one, what would it be to make the IG system, and maybe the government of the United States, some people might call it a bureaucracy, certainly made up of public servants, what would make it more trustworthy and effective? One core reform that would begin this.
Well, I think I don't know if I can pick just one because they're related, but we need to support IGs. We need to make sure they have the resources. They need adequate budgets to do all the things they're asking for. And also the Council of IGs, the coordinating entity, needs a budget so that they can watch the watchdogs as well. So we need to provide the IGs both the respect and the support in terms of budget to do the critically important tasks that they're assigned to do.
Well, Glenn Fine, a man with broad shoulders and not a pointy head, the author of a new book, Watchdogs, Inspector General, and the Battle for Honest and Accountable Government. It's getting into the weeds, but they're important weeds. Congratulations on the new book, Glenn, and continue, please, to do the job of protecting honest and impartial government in America. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure talking to you.